high above the lower valleys, where land slowly rose and the air often carried a thin veil of cloud. Mountain villages formed quiet places of continuity. These settlements did not appear suddenly, and they were not the result of single decisions or moments of change. Instead, they developed gradually, shaped by terrain, weather, and long-term presence. People remained in these places not because they were easy to live in, but because they were familiar, dependable, and steady over time. The landscape itself guided daily life. Slopes determined where homes could rest, and rocky ground influenced how paths curved and connected. Villagers learned these features early, not through instruction, but through repetition. Each movement across the land reinforced understanding. Over time, the environment became predictable, even when conditions shifted. Clouds came and went, winds changed direction, and temperatures varied, yet the underlying patterns remained consistent enough to support daily routine. Morning arrived slowly in these villages. Light filtered through mist rather than breaking sharply across the land. There was no sudden beginning to the day. People woke naturally, guided by quiet awareness rather than urgency. Sounds emerged, gently soft movement within homes. The low presence of animals nearby, and occasional footsteps along familiar paths. These sounds were not signals to begin work, but confirmations that life continued as expected. Homes were constructed with patience and restraint. Stone gathered from nearby ground formed thick walls that remained steady through cold and wind. Timber was used sparingly, shaped carefully, and reused whenever possible. Roofs were layered with thatch, replaced gradually as needed. Inside, spaces were simple and shared. Furniture remained minimal, made of wood, worn smooth through years of use. Objects were valued for their reliability rather than appearance, and they stayed in place for long periods without rearrangement. Life inside these homes followed a calm rhythm. Activities overlapped naturally, without strict separation. Preparing food, mending clothing, and resting occurred in the same spaces, allowing attention to shift gently rather than abruptly. There was no effort to isolate tasks. Instead, everything existed together, reinforcing a sense of continuity that reduced mental strain. Meals reflected this same steadiness. Ingredients were limited, familiar, and dependable. Bread, vegetables, grains, and simple warm dishes appeared regularly. Cooking was slow and unhurried, often done alongside other tasks. Eating followed hunger rather than schedule. These habits provided nourishment without stimulation, supporting calm energy throughout the day. Movement through the village remained unforced. Paths connected homes, storage areas, and working spaces without formal planning. They were shaped by years of walking rather than design. Villagers followed them instinctively, often without conscious awareness. Children learned these routes early, accompanying adults and absorbing patterns through observation. Over time, movement became effortless, requiring little thought or attention. Time itself was not measured precisely. Hours were felt through changes in light, temperature, and fatigue. Work continued when conditions allowed and eased when they did not. Rest occurred naturally, without guilt or justification. This absence of strict scheduling reduced pressure and allowed attention to remain relaxed and diffuse. Social presence was constant but unobtrusive. People lived close enough to remain aware of one another without intrusion. Voices were low, conversations brief, and silence common. Shared quiet was not uncomfortable. Instead, it reinforced connection without demanding engagement. This balance allowed individuals to feel supported while maintaining internal calm. Above all, life in these mountain villages was shaped by continuation rather than change. Each day resembled the one before it, not because innovation was avoided, but because stability was valued. The land encouraged patience, and people adapted by remaining attentive rather than reactive. Over time, this way of living became internalized, guiding behavior without conscious effort. In places above the clouds, where conditions could not be controlled as orally, calm persistence offered the greatest reliability through repetition, familiarity, and restraint. Villagers maintained a steady existence that unfolded slowly, supported by environment, habit, and shared understanding. As daily life continued in mountain villages above the clouds, routines settled into patterns that required little conscious thought. These routines were not written or announced. They existed quietly, carried forward by repetition and shared understanding. Each day followed familiar contours, shaped by light, weather, and physical comfort rather than by plans or schedules. People did not wake with lists of tasks. Instead, they moved gently into activity as conditions allowed. Work began without ceremony. When light increased and visibility improved, villagers stepped outside or shifted attention toward tasks that suited the moment. If the air remained cold or misty, work stayed closer to home. If the sky cleared, movement expanded outward. These adjustments were subtle and instinctive. There was no sense of delay or interruption. Each change was simply part of the day's unfolding. Agriculture in these villages relied on patience and observation. Fields were small and carefully placed, often held in position by low stone edges that followed the land's natural shape. Soil was thin in places, deeper in others, and villagers learned these variations over time. Crops were chosen not for speed or abundance, but for reliability. Hardy grains, roots, and vegetables grew slowly, responding to shorter seasons and cooler air. This slower growth aligned naturally with the village's pace. Tending fields required steady presence rather than force. Tools were simple, movements measured, and effort distributed evenly. There was no rush to complete work quickly. Instead, tasks were spread across days, reducing strain. This approach preserved both energy and attention, allowing people to remain calm even during longer periods of labor. Animals moved alongside human routine without distinction. Goats, sheep, and other livestock followed familiar routes, guided by memory and habit. Caring for them involved watching more than directing. Villagers adjusted subtly, responding to behavior rather than controlling it. These animals provided wool, milk, and assistance, but they also reinforced daily rhythm through their predictable presence. Inside homes, quieter work filled the hours. Spinning fibers, mending garments, preparing food, and maintaining tools occurred steadily. Hands moved with practiced familiarity. These tasks required little conscious effort, allowing thoughts to drift gently. Conversations, when they happened, were sparse and unforced. Silence remained common and comfortable, filling space without expectation. Storage played a central role in maintaining stability. Foods were preserved simply and kept nearby. Nothing was hidden or forgotten. Villagers remained aware of what they had and what they needed, adjusting consumption gradually rather than abruptly. This attentiveness reduced anxiety and prevented shortages without excess accumulation. Weather influenced every aspect of life without dominating it. Winds, rain, and cloud cover were noticed but not resisted. When conditions limited certain tasks, others took their place. This flexibility prevented frustration and allowed effort to remain balanced. Over time, villagers developed confidence in their ability to adapt without stress. Rest was not separated from work by rigid boundaries. Short pauses occurred naturally, guided by fatigue or discomfort. Sitting quietly, standing still, or observing surroundings provided recovery without disengagement. These moments blended into activity, maintaining flow rather than interruption. Children absorbed this rhythm gradually. They observed adults, participated when ready, and learned through repetition. There were no formal lessons, only steady exposure. Mistakes were corrected gently, often without words. This approach reduced pressure and allowed understanding to deepen naturally. Through these routines, daily life remained predictable without becoming stagnant. Each action supported the next, forming a continuous sequence that required little planning. This continuity reduced mental strain and supported calm awareness throughout the day. In mountain villages above the clouds, routine did not limit experience. Instead, it provided a steady foundation that allowed life to continue smoothly, guided by habit, environment, and quiet attentiveness. As time moved forward in mountain villages above the clouds, the passage of seasons shaped daily life in ways that were gradual and predictable. Change did not arrive suddenly or demand immediate response. Instead, it unfolded slowly, allowing people to adjust without disruption. Villagers became familiar with these transitions through repeated experience rather than explanation. Sensing shifts in temperature, light, and wind long before they required action. Winter approached gently. Cold increased over days and weeks, not hours. Frost appeared in shaded areas first, lingering longer each morning. Snow arrived in stages, sometimes light and temporary, sometimes settling more firmly. When it remained, activity slowed naturally. Paths became quieter and movement shortened. Work shifted inward, closer to warmth and shelter. There was no urgency to complete tasks before winter arrived, because preparation had already occurred gradually. Inside homes, winter days were calm and steady. Fires were kept modest, providing warmth without excess. People gathered near them without crowding, continuing quiet work that required little movement. Spinning, mending, tool maintenance, and food preparation filled the hours. Light entered softly through small openings, changing slowly throughout the day. Shadows lengthened without marking time precisely, allowing attention to remain unfocused. Food during winter relied on stored supplies. Grains, dried vegetables, and preserved foods were used thoughtfully. Meals remained simple and familiar, prepared in ways that had changed little over generations. Eating provided comfort through repetition rather than variety. Portions were steady, adjusted gradually as supplies diminished, preventing sudden scarcity. As winter eased, subtle signs marked the approach of spring. Snow receded unevenly, revealing patches of earth. Water flowed more freely, nourishing soil that had rested. Villagers observed these changes without haste. There was no rush to begin outdoor work. Instead, they waited, allowing conditions to settle. This patience reduced waste and preserved energy. Spring work began quietly. Fields were checked, tools prepared, and animals moved gradually. Effort increased slowly, aligned with improving conditions. Days lengthened, but pace remained measured. Villagers avoided overexertion, distributing labor evenly to maintain balance. Summer followed as a period of steady activity rather than intensity. Longer days allowed work to extend naturally, but rest remained integrated. Fields received regular attention, animals grazed familiar routes, and supplies were monitored carefully. There was no attempt to maximize output. Instead, villagers focused on maintaining consistency, ensuring that tasks were completed without strain. Heat was managed through timing rather than resistance. Work shifted to cooler parts of the day, and midday hours were quieter. Shade provided relief without disrupting routine. Water was used thoughtfully, supporting both people and animals without excess. As summer gradually gave way to autumn, air cooled and light softened. Harvests approached without urgency. Crops were gathered carefully, not all at once. Storage followed familiar patterns, with attention given to preservation rather than abundance. Excess was avoided, as it offered little advantage in a place where storage space and transport were limited. Autumn also brought subtle social shifts. Outdoor activity decreased gradually, and indoor spaces became more central again. Repairs were completed calmly, preparing homes for colder months. Clothing was adjusted, layers added or replaced as needed. These transitions occurred without announcement, blending into routine. Throughout these seasonal cycles, knowledge passed quietly between generations. Children observed changes alongside adults, learning through presence rather than instruction. Skills developed slowly, reinforced by repetition. Mistakes were accepted as part of learning, corrected gently without emphasis. Memory played an important role in maintaining seasonal balance. Past experiences informed present decisions, reducing uncertainty. Villagers remembered which areas thawed first, which fields held moisture longest, and which paths remained passable. This collective memory reduced risk without requiring planning. In this way, seasons did not disrupt life in mountain villages. Instead, they provided a gentle framework within which routine continued. Change occurred slowly, allowing people to remain calm and attentive, supported by habit, observation, and shared experience. Social life in mountain villages above the clouds developed slowly, shaped by proximity and shared routine rather than by deliberate organization. People lived close to one another not because of preference, but because the land encouraged it. Over time, this closeness created familiarity that did not require constant interaction. Individuals became aware of one another's presence, movements, and rhythms without needing conversation or explanation. Daily encounters were brief and unremarkable. People crossed paths along narrow routes, near shared work areas, or beside storage spaces. These meetings rarely interrupted activity. A nod, a few words, or simple acknowledgement was enough. There was no expectation to linger. Connection existed through repetition rather than exchange, reinforced by seeing the same faces in the same places each day. Cooperation emerged naturally from this familiarity. Assistance was offered when needed, often without being requested. Villagers noticed when someone required help and adjusted quietly. This responsiveness reduced the need for formal agreements or obligations. Over time, trust developed not through promises, but through consistent behavior. People learned what to expect from one another and relied on that predictability. Disagreements were uncommon and rarely escalated. When tensions arose, they were addressed indirectly or allowed to ease over time. The effort required to maintain daily life left little space for prolonged conflict. Instead, focus returned quickly to routine. This approach preserved harmony without requiring resolution, allowing emotional balance to remain steady. Roles within the village were flexible rather than fixed. While certain tasks aligned with experience or physical ability, villagers adapted as circumstances changed. Someone who usually worked outdoors might remain inside during illness or harsh weather, while others adjusted to cover responsibilities. This adaptability ensured continuity without strain, preventing disruption when conditions shifted. Elders played a quiet role in maintaining stability. Their presence provided continuity rather than authority. They shared knowledge through observation and occasional comment, not instruction. Younger villagers absorbed this guidance gradually, learning through proximity rather than teaching. Memory and experience flowed naturally, reinforcing established patterns. Cultural practices existed without separation from daily life. Simple observances marked certain times of year, often aligned with seasonal transitions. These practices were understated, reinforcing familiarity rather than creating spectacle. Participation was quiet and expected, requiring little effort or attention. Over time, these moments blended into routine, supporting continuity without emphasis. Spiritual awareness, when present, was subtle. It did not interrupt daily activity or demand focus. Instead, it existed alongside routine, providing reassurance rather than direction. This understated presence supported calm rather than reflection, allowing life to continue without distraction. Isolation from larger settlements did not create a sense of absence. Distance was accepted as normal. Contact with outsiders occurred occasionally through travelers or neighboring villages. But these interactions were brief and practical. New information was considered carefully, absorbed slowly, and integrated only when useful. This measured approach prevented disruption and preserved rhythm. Physical surroundings reinforced social calm. Stone walls, timber structures, and familiar paths created an environment that changed very slowly. Villagers did not attempt to alter appearances beyond necessity. What was accepted as part of use, and aging materials were repaired rather than replaced. This consistency reduced visual stimulation and supported mental ease. Evenings settled gently. As light faded, activity decreased naturally. People gathered indoors without ceremony, continuing quiet tasks or resting. Conversation remained minimal. Darkness arrived without resistance, encouraging rest rather than extension of the day. Sleep followed physical fatigue rather than schedule, supported by routine and familiarity. Through these social patterns, mountain village life remained steady and predictable. Interaction did not demand attention or energy. Instead, it supported calm presence, allowing individuals to remain grounded within shared routine. This balance, maintained quietly over time, reinforced the slow rhythm of life above the clouds. Work in mountain villages above the clouds followed a rhythm that had little to do with ambition or urgency. Tasks existed to support continuity rather than change, and effort was measured to preserve balance. People did not separate work from the rest of life. Instead, it unfolded gently within the day, shaped by light, weather, and physical comfort. This integration reduced strain and allowed attention to remain steady. Tools were simple and familiar: iron blades, wooden handles, and rough surfaces reflected long use rather than refinement. Villagers knew these tools intimately, recognizing their weight, balance, and limitations without conscious thought. Repairs were made quietly and repeatedly, extending usefulness rather than seeking replacement. This familiarity reduced effort and allowed work to proceed calmly, even when tasks required time and patience. Outdoor labor followed the land's contours. Slopes dictated movement, and paths curved naturally around obstacles. Carrying loads required careful pacing, with frequent pauses to maintain balance and conserve energy. People moved deliberately, avoiding sudden shifts. This steadiness was learned over years of repetition, reinforced by the understanding that haste offered little advantage in such terrain. Whether interruptions were accepted as part of routine, rain, wind, or low visibility shifted activity without frustration. When conditions limited outdoor work, attention moved indoors. Tasks were chosen to match circumstances rather than resist them. This flexibility prevented exhaustion and allowed effort to remain evenly distributed across days. Inside homes, quiet work continued steadily. Spinning fibers, mending garments, shaping wood, and maintaining tools filled the hours. Hands moved with practiced ease, guided by habit rather than instruction. These tasks required little conscious focus, allowing thoughts to drift gently. Silence often accompanied this work, creating an atmosphere of calm presence rather than concentration. Food preparation followed similar patterns. Ingredients were combined in familiar ways, creating meals that required minimal attention. Cooking occurred slowly, often alongside other activities. There was no pressure to finish quickly. Eating followed hunger rather than time, with portions adjusted naturally. This approach supported steady energy without overstretching. Rest was woven into the working day. Short pauses occurred without announcement, guided by fatigue rather than schedule. Sitting quietly, standing still, or observing surroundings provided recovery without disengagement. These moments were not considered breaks, but part of the working rhythm. By integrating rest, villagers avoided exhaustion and maintained consistent pace. Children participated gradually in work. They observed adults, assisted when able, and learned through repetition. There were no formal expectations or deadlines. Skills developed slowly, reinforced by patience. Mistakes were corrected gently, often without words. This approach reduced pressure and allowed confidence to grow naturally. Sharing of labor occurred quietly. When tasks exceeded individual capacity, others assisted without ceremony. This cooperation did not require coordination or acknowledgement. It emerged naturally from awareness of shared needs. Over time, such assistance reinforced trust and reduced individual burden. Work did not aim to improve conditions beyond necessity. Effort focused on maintenance rather than expansion. Fields were tended to remain productive, structures were repaired to remain sound, and tools were maintained to remain functional. This restraint prevented overextension and preserved stability. As days passed, work blended seamlessly into life. There were no clear beginnings or endings, only gradual transitions. Activity increased and decreased in response to conditions rather than plans. This fluidity reduced mental strain, allowing attention to remain calm and diffuse. In mountain villages above the clouds, work supported rest rather than competing with it. Through repetition, familiarity, and measured effort, villagers maintained balance. This steady approach allowed life to continue smoothly, guided by habit, environment, and quiet persistence. The physical arrangement of mountain villages above the clouds reflected long familiarity rather than deliberate design. Buildings were placed where the land allowed them to remain stable, not where they appeared orderly. Over time, this created settlements that felt settled rather than planned. Paths, walls, and open spaces emerged gradually, shaped by repeated use and quiet adjustment rather than intention. Homes were modest and practical, Their size reflected necessity rather than preference. Interior spaces served multiple purposes throughout the day, shifting gently as activities changed. Sleeping, eating, and working occurred within the same rooms, reducing separation and simplifying movement. This closeness supported awareness without intrusion, allowing people to remain attuned to one another without constant interaction. Walls were thick and solid, built to remain steady against wind and cold. Openings were small, admitting light carefully and maintaining warmth. Inside, light moved slowly across surfaces, changing subtly throughout the day. Shadows lengthened and shortened without marking precise time, allowing attention to drift rather than focus. This gentle lighting supported calm and reduced stimulation. Furniture remained minimal. Wooden tables, benches, and stools were used for many purposes. Their surfaces showed signs of long use, worn smooth by hands and movement. Objects stayed in place for extended periods, creating consistency. Villagers rarely rearranged their surroundings, preferring familiarity over novelty. This stability reduced decision-making and preserved mental ease. Storage areas blended seamlessly into living spaces. Food, tools, and materials were kept nearby, accessible without clutter. Organization was practical rather than aesthetic. Items were placed where they had always been, guided by memory rather than labels. This arrangement reduced effort and allowed tasks to proceed without interruption. Outdoor spaces functioned as extensions of the home. Areas between buildings served as places for movement, work, and occasional gathering. These spaces were not designated formally. Instead, they became shared through repeated use. Villagers adjusted their behavior subtly, maintaining balance without instruction. Presence was acknowledged quietly, without demand. Sound moved gently through these spaces. Voices carried differently depending on distance and enclosure. People adjusted volume instinctively, maintaining a low level of sound. This sensitivity preserved calm throughout the village, even during periods of activity. Loud noises were uncommon and unnecessary. Maintenance occurred continuously but unobtrusively. Repairs were made as soon as they were needed, often quietly and without comment. This prevented deterioration without creating disruption. Over time, buildings aged gradually, reflecting use rather than neglect. Where it was accepted as part of function, and repairs reinforced continuity. Water sources were used thoughtfully. Streams, wells, or collected runoff provided essential support. Access paths remained clear through repeated use rather than construction. Villagers approached these areas calmly, often without conversation, completing tasks efficiently and returning to routine. Seasonal changes influenced spatial use without altering structure. In colder months, activity concentrated indoors. In warmer periods, work extended outward. These shifts occurred naturally, guided by comfort rather than plan. The built environment accommodated these changes without modification, demonstrating its adaptability. Children learned spatial awareness early. They moved through the village alongside adults, absorbing patterns through observation. Boundaries were understood without explanation. This familiarity reduced risk and fostered confidence, allowing movement without anxiety. Visitors, when they arrived, noticed the village's quiet cohesion. There were no signs to guide movement, yet paths were clear. This clarity emerged from consistency rather than instruction. Outsiders adapted quickly by observing, following established patterns without disruption. Through these physical arrangements, village life remained calm and predictable. The environment did not demand attention. Instead, it supported routine gently, allowing people to focus inward and remain present without effort. This quiet integration of space and life reinforced the slow rhythm that defined existence above the clouds. Communication within mountain villages above the clouds relied less on speech and more on shared presence. Much of what needed to be known was understood without being said. People became familiar with one another's routines through observation rather than conversation. Movement, timing, and posture conveyed information quietly, allowing daily life to continue without interruption. When words were used, they were measured and unhurried. Speech did not seek to persuade or instruct. Instead, it confirmed what was already understood. Conversations were often brief, occurring naturally when paths crossed or tasks overlapped. Topics repeated gently, returning to familiar matters rather than introducing novelty. This repetition offered reassurance, reinforcing continuity rather than interest. Silence was common and comfortable. It filled shared spaces without creating distance. Villagers did not feel pressured to speak, to maintain connection. Sitting or working together in quiet presence was ordinary, requiring no explanation. This acceptance of silence reduced stimulation and allowed attention to remain relaxed. Information traveled slowly within the village. News was absorbed gradually, discussed briefly, and then allowed to settle. There was no urgency to act immediately. Decisions, when required, were made over time, informed by experience rather than reaction. This pace prevented disruption and preserved balance. Teaching occurred without formal structure. Skills were demonstrated through action rather than explanation. Younger villagers observed adults repeatedly, absorbing patterns through exposure. Participation increased naturally as confidence developed. Errors were corrected gently, often through example rather than words. This approach reduced pressure and allowed learning to remain calm. Memory functioned collectively rather than individually. Knowledge was distributed across the community, reducing reliance on any one person. Villagers remembered different aspects of daily life, from seasonal changes to tool maintenance. This shared memory supported continuity without requiring records or instruction. Emotional expression remained subdued. Joy, concern, and fatigue were acknowledged quietly, without display. There was little emphasis on individual feeling. Instead, emotional states were absorbed into routine, addressed through rest, work adjustment, or shared presence. This restraint prevented emotional spikes and maintained calm atmosphere. Disagreements, when they occurred, were handled indirectly. Tension was allowed to ease over time rather than confronted. Daily routine continued, providing structure that reduced focus on conflict. This approach preserved harmony without resolution, relying on patience rather than discussion. Visitors to the village adapted quickly to this communication style. They learned by observing rather than asking. Villagers did not explain customs or expectations. Instead, they continued routine, allowing newcomers to follow. This method preserved stability and prevented disruption. Storytelling existed quietly within daily life. Stories were shared casually, often during repetitive tasks or rest. They did not aim to entertain or instruct dramatically. Instead, they reinforced memory and continuity, connecting present experience with familiar past events. These stories were told without emphasis, allowing listeners to drift in and out of attention. Listening required little effort. Because content was familiar and tone was steady, attention could soften without losing understanding. This gentle listening supported rest even while awake, reducing mental activity. Children learned communication patterns early. They observed when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to express needs without urgency. This awareness developed gradually, guided by example rather than correction. Over time, they became attuned to subtle cues, maintaining harmony without instruction. Through these patterns, communication supported calm existence rather than stimulating thought. Words and silence balanced naturally, creating an environment where attention could rest. This understated exchange of information allowed village life to continue smoothly, guided by presence, familiarity, and shared rhythm above the clouds. Movement beyond the village occurred infrequently and without urgency. Travel in mountain regions required preparation, awareness, and patience, and for this reason it was undertaken only when needed. Villagers did not leave their settlements out of curiosity or restlessness. Instead, journeys were part of maintaining balance, supporting connections that already existed rather than seeking new ones. Paths leading away from the village were narrow and familiar. They followed the natural shape of the land, curving around slopes, stones, and wooded areas. These routes had been formed gradually through repeated use rather than construction. Walking them required steady attention rather than speed. Footing was chosen carefully, and pace remained slow, conserving energy and reducing risk. Travelers carried little. What was needed was known in advance, and excess was avoided. Loads were balanced carefully, adjusted to terrain and distance. Villagers understood their own limits, stopping when necessary and continuing when conditions allowed. These journeys were quiet, marked more by observation than interaction. Sounds of wind, distant water, and footsteps accompanied movement, reinforcing awareness of surroundings. Encounters with neighboring villages were calm and brief. Exchanges involved practical matters such as food, tools, or information. There was no expectation of extended conversation. After needs were addressed, people returned along familiar paths, resuming routine without disruption. These interactions reinforce connection without altering daily rhythm. Isolation was accepted rather than resisted. Distance from larger settlements did not create discomfort. Instead, it supported self-reliance while allowing occasional contact when required. Villagers existed independently, yet remained aware of one another through shared patterns and occasional exchange. This balance reduced dependence without creating separation. Change entered village lives slowly. New practices, when introduced, were observed over time before adoption. Villagers evaluated usefulness through experience rather than explanation. Old methods remained alongside adjustments, creating continuity rather than replacement. This gradual integration prevented disruption and preserved calm. Aging was woven into daily life without distinction. Elder villagers remained present within routine, contributing through observation, memory, and occasional guidance. Their movements slowed naturally, and responsibilities adjusted accordingly. There was no formal transition. Presence itself maintained connection between past and present. Illness and fatigue were approached quietly. When someone required rest, others adjusted without comment. Tasks shifted gently, maintaining balance without acknowledgement. Recovery occurred within routine rather than outside it. This approach reduced anxiety and allowed healing to proceed naturally. Death, when it occurred, was absorbed into daily life with simplicity. Rituals were modest, acknowledging loss without spectacle. Routine resumed gently afterward, providing stability through familiarity. Memory persisted through shared presence rather than ceremony, allowing continuity to remain intact. Nightfall brought natural quiet. As light faded, activity decreased without effort. People gathered indoors, continuing simple tasks or resting. Conversation remained minimal. Darkness was accepted rather than resisted, encouraging sleep without stimulation. Without artificial light, evenings were brief and calm. Sleep followed physical rhythm rather than schedule. Fatigue guided rest, and waking occurred naturally. Dreams, when remembered, blended with memory and routine, reflecting the steady pace of life. Night passed without interruption, supported by consistent habits and environment. Over time, these patterns created a life that moved without pressure. Travel, interaction, change, and rest unfolded gradually, guided by familiarity rather than intention. In mountain villages above the clouds, existence remained steady and understated. Each day flowed into the next, supported by habit, patience, and shared understanding, allowing life to continue quietly within its surroundings. As daily life continued in mountain villages above the clouds, attention often settled on the subtle balance between effort and preservation. Villagers understood, through long familiarity, that resources were limited not only by quantity but by access. Everything required to support life had to be carried, grown, gathered, or maintained within a demanding environment. This awareness shaped behavior quietly, guiding choices without constant thought. Water was approached with care and respect. Streams, springs, or collected runoff provided essential support, yet their availability could vary with season and weather. Villagers learned to observe these patterns closely. Use was measured, never excessive. Fetching water followed familiar paths and routines, becoming a steady part of the day rather than a task to be completed quickly. Containers were filled carefully, carried slowly, and emptied with intention. Through repetition, this practice became effortless. Fuel for warmth and cooking was gathered gradually. Wood was collected over time, often in small amounts, preventing exhaustion and preserving nearby resources. Villagers avoided stripping any one area completely. Instead, they rotated, gathering locations, allowing regrowth. This patience ensured continuity without requiring rules or enforcement. Fires were kept modest, providing necessary warmth without waste. Food management followed similar principles. Ingredients were used fully, with little discarded. Scraps were repurposed, fed to animals, or returned to the earth. Cooking methods emphasized simplicity, reducing need for varied supplies. This careful use reduced pressure on storage and ensured steady nourishment throughout the year. Clothing was maintained thoughtfully. Garments were repaired repeatedly, altered as bodies changed, and passed between family members when possible. Wool and simple fabrics were valued for durability rather than appearance. Layers were adjusted gradually as weather shifted, supporting comfort without excess. This maintenance reduced need for replacement and reinforced familiarity. Tools received ongoing attention. Blades were sharpened regularly, handles repaired, and joints tightened. Villagers noticed small changes in performance and addressed them early. This attentiveness prevented sudden failure and reduced risk during work. Over time, tools became extensions of routine, trusted and predictable. Waste was minimal and rarely noticed. Broken items were repurposed when possible. Materials returned to the environment slowly, without accumulation. This absence of visible waste contributed to the village's calm appearance, reinforcing a sense of order without effort. Seasonal planning occurred without formal structure. Villagers adjusted behavior gradually, responding to subtle signs rather than fixed dates. Supplies were monitored quietly, consumption adjusted without discussion. This collective attentiveness reduced anxiety and prevented shortages without requiring oversight. Trade, when it occurred, was limited and practical. Goods exchanged with neighboring villages supplemented rather than replaced local production. These exchanges were infrequent and modest, focused on necessity rather than variety. Villagers remained aware of their dependence on their own environment, reinforcing self-sufficiency. Children absorbed these practices through observation. They learned to value materials by watching adults use and maintain them carefully. Over time, this awareness became instinctive, guiding behavior without instruction. Respect for resources developed naturally, embedded in daily routine. Emotional attachment to objects remained limited. Items were valued for function rather than sentiment. When something wore out beyond repair, it was accepted without distress. Replacement occurred slowly, guided by need rather than desire. This detachment reduced mental burden and supported calm. Through these habits, villagers maintained balance within a demanding environment. Resource use did not dominate thought, yet it guided behavior quietly. Each action supported the next, forming a continuous pattern that required little attention. In mountain villages above the clouds, this careful relationship with resources allowed life to continue steadily. By remaining attentive without urgency, villagers preserved what they needed, reduced strain, and supported the slow rhythm that defined their existence. Time in mountain villages above the clouds was experienced differently than in places where movement and change occurred more quickly. Rather than being measured or counted, time was felt through repetition and familiarity. Days were not separated sharply from one another. Instead, they blended together, forming a continuous flow that reduced awareness of passing hours. This way of experiencing time supported calm presence and allowed attention to remain unfocused. Morning did not announce itself loudly. Light increased gradually, and villagers became aware of wakefulness through subtle signals rather than alarms or calls. Bodies adjusted naturally, guided by rest and fatigue. Rising occurred without urgency. Some people remained still longer, while others began gentle movement. This variation was accepted without comment, reflecting individual needs rather than expectation. Throughout the day, activity followed comfort rather than schedule. Tasks began when conditions allowed and paused when effort felt complete. There was no pressure to fill every moment. Stillness was not considered wasted time. Instead, it was part of the rhythm that allowed energy to remain balanced. Sitting quietly, standing in place, or observing surroundings were common and unremarkable. Light played an important role in shaping awareness. As the sun moved across the sky, brightness shifted slowly. Shadows changed position gradually, marking time without demanding attention. Villagers noticed these changes without interpretation. They provided gentle structure, guiding movement and rest without instruction. Sound also contributed to the sense of time. Familiar noises appeared at predictable moments. Animals stirred, footsteps passed, tools made contact with wood or earth. These sounds did not signal urgency. Instead, they confirmed continuity, reinforcing that life followed known patterns. When sound diminished, quiet filled the space without discomfort. Meals occurred when hunger emerged rather than at fixed times. Preparation followed familiar routines, and eating proceeded calmly. This flexibility reduced anticipation and allowed attention to remain present. There was no sense of delay or interruption. Food supported energy quietly, without becoming an event. Afternoons often unfolded slowly. Effort decreased naturally as fatigue increased. Tasks shifted toward those requiring less movement or concentration. This adjustment occurred without decision. Bodies responded instinctively, conserving energy for the following day. As evening approached, light softened and activity diminished. Villagers did not resist this change. Instead, they allowed it to guide behavior. Work concluded gradually, and attention turned inward. Indoor spaces became central again, providing warmth and familiarity. Night arrived without ceremony. Darkness settled, and movement slowed further. Artificial light remained limited, encouraging rest rather than extension of the day. People gathered quietly or remained alone, continuing simple tasks or resting. Conversation was minimal, and silence was common. Sleep followed physical rhythm rather than expectation. Fatigue guided rest, and waking occurred naturally. Dreams, when remembered, blended with routine and memory, reflecting the slow pace of daily life. Night passed without interruption, supported by consistency and familiarity. Seasons influenced this experience of time without altering its quality. Shorter days brought longer periods of rest, while longer days allowed extended activity. These shifts occurred gradually, preventing disruption. Villagers adjusted without effort, guided by environment rather than plan. Children learned this sense of time through observation. They followed adults, noticing when activity increased or decreased. Over time, they internalized these patterns, responding instinctively rather than counting hours. This awareness supported calm development and reduced pressure. Through these experiences, time in mountain villages remained gentle and unstructured. It did not demand attention or measurement. Instead, it supported steady presence, allowing life to continue without urgency. This quiet flow of time reinforced the sleep-first rhythm that defined existence above the clouds. Memory in mountain villages above the clouds existed as a quiet presence rather than a record of events. People did not preserve the past through written accounts or formal retelling. Instead, memory lived within routine, embedded in repeated actions, familiar places, and shared habits. What had happened before was reflected in what continued to be done, allowing the past to remain present without emphasis. Villagers remembered through practice the way a field was tended, the order in which tools were used, or the method by which food was prepared, all carried traces of earlier experience. These actions were repeated not to honor tradition, but because they had proven reliable. Over time, repetition reinforced memory without requiring reflection. Knowledge remained active through use rather than recall. Stories were shared quietly, often during moments of rest or gentle work. They did not follow structured beginnings or endings. Instead, they emerged naturally, woven into conversation without drawing attention. These accounts rarely focused on dramatic events. They described ordinary moments, familiar places, and known people. Their purpose was not to entertain, but to confirm continuity. Listeners did not give full attention to these stories at all times. Attention drifted in and out without loss. Familiar details allowed understanding to persist even when focus softened. This gentle listening supported calm awareness rather than engagement, allowing memory to pass through the mind without effort. Elders contributed to memory through presence rather than instruction. Their movements, choices, and reactions reflected experience gained over years. Younger villagers observed these patterns, absorbing knowledge gradually. Advice, when given, was brief and understated. Often, example replaced explanation, allowing learning to occur without pressure. Places themselves held memory. Paths worn smooth by countless steps guided movement without thought. Buildings bore marks of repair and use, reflecting adaptation rather than change. Fields revealed patterns of cultivation that had developed over generations. These physical traces reminded villagers of what had worked before, supporting confidence without reflection. Seasonal awareness also relied on memory. Villagers recalled when snow had lingered longest, which slopes warmed first, and where water remained available during dry periods. This knowledge was not stored formally. It existed within collective awareness, guiding decisions quietly. Over time, this shared memory reduced uncertainty and prevented unnecessary effort. Change was evaluated through memory rather than anticipation. New practices were compared gently with familiar ones. If they aligned with existing patterns, they were adopted slowly. If not, they faded without resistance. This process preserved stability without preventing adjustment, allowing life to continue smoothly. Loss was remembered without emphasis. Those who had died remained present through shared routines and familiar places. There was no need for frequent mention. Memory persisted naturally, woven into daily life. This quiet remembrance reduced emotional strain and allowed routine to provide comfort. Children learned memory as part of living. They observed how adults repeated actions, returned to certain places, and adjusted behavior based on experience. Over time, they internalized this process, relying on memory without conscious effort. This gradual learning supported confidence and calm development. Objects also carried memory. Tools worn smooth by use reflected countless hours of work. Clothing altered and repaired over time held familiarity rather than sentiment. These items were not preserved for remembrance, but their continued use reinforced connection to past effort. Through these subtle expressions, memory remained active without becoming heavy. It did not demand attention or reflection. Instead, it guided behavior quietly, supporting continuity without nostalgia. In mountain villages above the clouds, memory functioned as a steady foundation. It informed daily life without interruption, allowing people to remain grounded in routine. By carrying the past within present action, villagers maintained balance and calm, supporting the slow rhythm that defined their existence. Belief and meaning in mountain villages above the clouds were not expressed through constant reflection or formal discussion. Instead, they existed quietly alongside daily life, integrated into routine rather than separated from it. People did not pause often to question purpose or direction. Meaning was found through continuation, through doing what had always been done, and through remaining attentive to the immediate world around them. Spiritual awareness, where present did not interrupt activity. It did not demand focus or explanation. Simple gestures, familiar phrases, or moments of stillness occurred naturally, often without conscious intention. These expressions were brief and understated, woven into routine rather than marked as distinct events. Their purpose was reassurance rather than instruction. Villagers did not seek dramatic signs or revelations. Instead, they trusted gradual patterns, the return of seasons, the reliability of familiar tasks, and the steady presence of the land provided a sense of order. This order did not require interpretation. It was felt through repetition, reinforcing confidence without thought. Places associated with shared meaning were modest and unremarkable. A small, cleared area, a familiar stone, or a quiet interior space could hold significance simply because it had always been there. These places were not distinguished by decoration or separation. They remained part of everyday movement, encountered without ceremony. Rituals, when they occurred, were simple and brief. They marked transitions gently rather than dramatically. A change in season, the beginning of certain work, or moments of loss were acknowledged quietly. Participation required little effort and drew no attention. These practices reinforced continuity rather than marking change. There was little emphasis on explanation. Beliefs were not debated or taught formally. Instead, they were absorbed through observation. Children noticed when adults paused, adjusted behavior, or observed certain moments. Over time, these patterns became familiar, guiding behavior without instruction. Uncertainty was accepted as part of life. Villagers did not attempt to control what could not be predicted. Weather, illness, and chance were approached with patience rather than resistance. This acceptance reduced anxiety and allowed focus to remain on what could be done. Meaning emerged through response rather than anticipation. Moral guidance was subtle. Expectations were communicated through example rather than rule. People learned how to behave by watching how others responded to difficulty, fatigue, or loss. Compassion, restraint, and patience were demonstrated quietly, reinforcing values without declaration. Loss and hardship were absorbed into routine rather than isolated. When difficulties arose, villagers adjusted gently, redistributing effort and allowing time to restore balance. There was no attempt to explain hardship away. Instead, routine provided stability, offering comfort through familiarity rather than resolution. Joy, when experienced, was understated. It appeared in moments of ease, successful effort, or shared presence. These moments were not celebrated loudly. Instead, they passed quietly, leaving a sense of contentment rather than excitement. This restraint preserved emotional balance and supported calm. Nature itself contributed to this sense of meaning. Mountains, clouds, wind, and light were constant companions. Villagers observed them without interpretation. Their presence reinforced scale and continuity, reminding people of their place without requiring reflection. This awareness grounded experience and reduced self-focus, Time reinforced meaning through repetition. As days followed familiar patterns, confidence grew. There was reassurance in knowing what to expect, even when conditions varied. This predictability allowed attention to soften, reducing mental activity and supporting rest. In this way, belief and meaning did not exist as separate ideas in mountain villages above the clouds. They were lived rather than spoken, experienced rather than examined. Through routine, acceptance, and quiet presence, villagers maintained a sense of order that supported calm existence. Meaning remained steady and unobtrusive, allowing life to continue gently within its surroundings. As life continued in mountain villages above the clouds, attention often settled on the way knowledge was preserved and passed along without formal systems. There were no written records to consult, no schedules to follow, and no centralized authority to guide daily behavior. Instead, understanding moved quietly between people through observation, repetition, and shared presence. This method required patience, but it also reduced pressure, allowing learning to unfold naturally. Skills were not introduced suddenly. Children encountered tasks gradually, first by watching, then by assisting, and eventually by participating fully. There was no expectation to master anything quickly. Progress occurred at an individual pace, guided by comfort and confidence rather than comparison. Adults adjusted their involvement subtly, offering guidance when needed and stepping back when not. This balance allowed learning to remain calm and unforced. Mistakes were treated as part of routine rather than failure. When errors occurred, they were corrected gently, often through demonstration rather than explanation. There was no emphasis on blame or consequence. Instead, correction was absorbed into ongoing activity, allowing work to continue without interruption. Over time, this approach built confidence and reduced anxiety, supporting steady development. Knowledge related to the land was particularly important. Villagers learned where paths remained passable, which areas retained moisture, and how weather patterns shifted across seasons. This information was not taught formally. Instead, it was absorbed through repeated exposure. Over time, familiarity replaced instruction, allowing individuals to respond instinctively to changing conditions. Craft skills followed similar patterns. Spinning, weaving, tool maintenance, and food preparation were learnt through proximity. Children observed adults performing these tasks daily, internalizing movements and sequences. Participation increased naturally as ability grew. This gradual process prevented overwhelm and allowed skill to develop steadily. Social expectations were also learned informally. Children noticed how adults interacted when they spoke and when they remained silent. They observed responses to fatigue, conflict, and need. Through this observation, they learned appropriate behavior without being told. This method reinforced harmony without requiring rules. Elders contributed to learning through presence rather than instruction. Their experience was visible in their choices and reactions. Younger villagers watched closely, absorbing patterns over time. Advice, when given, was brief and understated. Often, silence conveyed more than words. Memory played a central role in this system. Knowledge was retained through use rather than recall. Tasks repeated daily reinforced understanding automatically. Seasonal changes, resource management, and social patterns were remembered because they were lived repeatedly. This form of memory required no effort, allowing attention to remain calm. Change within this learning system occurred slowly. New methods were introduced cautiously, observed over time before adoption. Villagers compared them quietly with existing practices, evaluating usefulness through experience rather than discussion. If a new approach aligned with familiar patterns, it was integrated gradually. If not, it faded without resistance. This approach reduced disruption. Learning did not create pressure or urgency. Instead, it blended into daily life, allowing individuals to develop skills and understanding without strain. Confidence grew steadily, supported by repetition and familiarity. Learning also supported rest. Because tasks were familiar and predictable, they required less conscious effort. Attention could soften without loss of function. This reduced mental activity, supporting calm even during work. Through this quiet transmission of knowledge, mountain villages maintained continuity across generations. Skills, values, and understanding persisted without formal preservation. By relying on observation, repetition, and patience, villagers ensured that life continued smoothly. This steady learning process reinforced the slow rhythm that defined existence above the clouds. As years passed in mountain villages above the clouds, the relationship between people and their environment remained steady and reciprocal. Villagers did not view the land as something separate from daily life. Instead, it existed as a constant presence, shaping behavior quietly and consistently. Mountains, slopes, and valleys were not obstacles to overcome, but conditions to live within. This acceptance reduced tension and allowed routine to continue without resistance. Weather was approached with attentiveness rather than concern. Changes in wind direction, cloud movement, or air temperature were noticed early, often before they required response. Villagers learned to read these signs through experience rather than instruction. Over time, this awareness became instinctive. Adjustments were made gently, without urgency, ensuring that activity remained aligned with conditions. Paths through the landscape reflected this long familiarity. They followed contours that minimized effort and risk. Over years of use, these routes became smooth and predictable. Villagers walked them without conscious thought, adjusting pace and posture naturally. This ease reduced physical strain and supported calm movement, even in difficult terrain. Fields and grazing areas were treated with restraint. Villagers understood the limits of soil and vegetation in mountain environments. Cultivation occurred carefully, avoiding overuse. Areas were allowed to rest when needed, maintaining long-term productivity. This patience ensured continuity without requiring strict rules or enforcement. Animals interacted with the landscape alongside people. Grazing followed familiar patterns, guided by memory rather than direction. Villagers observed animal behavior closely, adjusting movement and care accordingly. This attentiveness reduced conflict between use and preservation, maintaining balance without intervention. Natural resources were gathered gradually. Wood, stone, and plants were taken in small amounts, spread across time and location. This approach prevented depletion and reduced effort. Villagers understood that abundance in one moment did not guarantee future availability. By remaining patient, they preserved access over years rather than days. Seasonal changes reinforced this relationship. Snow altered movement but did not disrupt routine. Melting water nourished soil without announcement. Growth followed its own pace, independent of expectation. Villagers adjusted gently, allowing the environment to guide behavior rather than attempting to control it. Sound carried differently in mountain spaces. Wind, water, and distant movement created a constant background. Villagers became accustomed to these sounds, using them to gauge conditions without focus. Silence, when it occurred, felt natural rather than empty. This auditory environment supported calm awareness throughout the day. Light interacted with terrain in subtle ways. Slopes caught sunlight at different times, creating varied brightness across the village. Villagers noticed these patterns unconsciously, choosing where to work or rest accordingly. This responsiveness reduced discomfort and supported steady energy. Children learned environmental awareness early. They followed adults through fields, paths, and working areas, observing adjustments without explanation. Over time, they absorbed this knowledge naturally, responding to conditions instinctively. This gradual learning reduced risk and fostered confidence without instruction. The environment also shaped social behavior. Movement slowed naturally in difficult conditions, encouraging patience and cooperation. Villagers adjusted expectations collectively, reducing pressure on individuals. This shared response reinforced cohesion without coordination. Change within the environment was accepted as gradual. Landslides, erosion, or altered water flow were addressed calmly. Adjustments were made where necessary, but routine continued. Villagers understood that adaptation occurred over time rather than immediately. This perspective reduced anxiety and preserved balance. Through this steady interaction with land and weather, mountain villages maintained stability. The environment did not demand constant attention or reaction. Instead, it guided behavior quietly, supporting a rhythm that remained consistent across years. In places above the clouds, where control was limited, acceptance provided reliability. By remaining attentive without urgency, villagers aligned themselves with their surroundings. This quiet relationship between people and land reinforced the slow, restful rhythm that defined daily life in mountain villages. As life continued in mountain villages above the clouds, the rhythm of each day became less noticeable over time. Days did not stand apart from one another. Instead, they blended into a single, extended experience shaped by repetition and familiarity. Villagers rarely reflected on how one day differed from the last. What mattered was that life remained steady predictable and quietly supported by routine. Work and rest existed side by side without clear separation. Effort rose and fell naturally throughout the day. When strength was available, tasks were performed calmly. When fatigue appeared, movement slowed without resistance. There was no pressure to complete more than what felt possible. This balance reduced strain and allowed both body and mind to remain at ease. Sound remained gentle and consistent. Footsteps, distant voices, whined along stone walls, and the occasional call of animals created a soft background that rarely changed. These sounds did not demand attention. They confirmed continuity. Silence, when it appeared, felt natural rather than empty, allowing awareness to soften without discomfort. Inside homes, familiar objects remained in their places. Wooden tables, clay vessels, folded garments, and tools worn smooth by years of use required no thought. Their presence reassured rather than stimulated. There was comfort in knowing where everything belonged, and in not needing to adjust surroundings constantly. Evening approached slowly. Lights faded without urgency, and activity followed. Villagers did not resist the arrival of night. Instead, they allowed it to guide behavior. Movement became minimal. Conversations, if they occurred, remained brief and quiet. Darkness settled without ceremony. Rest did not feel earned or deserved. It simply arrived when effort subsided. People rested because it was time to rest, not because a task had been completed. This acceptance removed guilt and anticipation, allowing sleep to come naturally. Over time, this pattern shaped perception itself. The mind learned not to seek novelty or resolution. Thoughts slowed. Attention rested more easily in the present moment. Memory became less focused on individual events and more attuned to patterns. What mattered was not what happened, but that life continued in a familiar way. Children absorbed this rhythm early. They learned that stillness was acceptable, that repetition was comforting, and that change arrived gradually. There was no rush to grow or become something else. Life unfolded at its own pace, guided by environment rather than ambition. Elders remained part of this rhythm as well. Their presence did not mark endings. Instead, it reinforced continuity. Even as movement slowed, routine continued around them, integrating every stage of life without distinction. Through all of this, the village itself remained unchanged in spirit. Stone walls aged, paths shifted slightly, roofs were repaired, yet the overall rhythm persisted. Nothing needed to be completed, nothing needed to be concluded. Life simply continued, day after day, above the clouds. In mountain villages, above the clouds, life was not experienced as a journey towards something else. There was no expectation of progress, achievement, or resolution. Instead, existence unfolded as a continuous present, shaped by routine, familiarity, and quiet acceptance. This way of living did not require reflection. It was felt rather than understood. Villagers did not ask what life meant. Meaning emerged naturally through continuation. Fields were tended so they would remain usable. Homes were maintained so they would continue to shelter. Knowledge was passed quietly so routine could persist. Nothing needed to be preserved deliberately. Continuity itself was enough. Time moved without emphasis. Days passed, seasons shifted, and years accumulated without being counted. Change occurred slowly, often unnoticed. What remained constant was the rhythm of living, waking, moving, resting, and sleeping in harmony with the environment. Clouds drifted across valleys below the village, sometimes revealing distant landscapes, sometimes hiding them entirely. These changes were observed without curiosity or concern. They were part of the same steady world that shaped daily life. Nothing needed to be interpreted. Sound and silence continued their quiet balance. Wind, distant water, and familiar village noises faded in and out without interruption. At night, darkness arrived gently, encouraging rest without demand. Sleep followed naturally, supported by consistency and calm. Memory softened over time. Individual days blended together. What remained was a sense of familiarity rather than detail. This allowed the mind to rest, free from the need to organize or recall. Life did not require narrative. It simply existed. Even when individuals were no longer present, the rhythm remained. Paths were still walked. Homes were still used. The village continued without interruption. Life did not pause or conclude. It flowed onward, unchanged in its quiet nature. For those who lived there, this steadiness offered something rare, an existence without urgency. There was no need to hurry, no need to finish, and no need to arrive anywhere else. Each moment was sufficient on its own. And so, life above the clouds continued as it always had, calm, unhurried, and uninterrupted. Days passed into nights, nights into days, all held together by familiarity and routine. Nothing announced an ending. Nothing demanded attention. The story did not conclude. It simply continued